Hello and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn, all about the sustainability trends of 2024. So the first trend that we're going to look at is one that really started creeping in last year and really hit the headlines in October 2023, which is the move away from brand purpose as being kind of the primary motivation in people's campaigns. And we really saw this hit the headlines when Unilever announced that they were going to move away from purpose for some of their brands. In 2019, they had said that they were going to be embedding purpose in every single brand that they owned. And now, under a new CEO, they've said that actually that can be a distraction for some brands and that it can be force fitted in, and that doesn't really work. So they're going to be moving away from that. And then with the Christmas advertising, which is always a good barometer of what the trends are going to be for the year ahead in retail, we saw brands really lean heavily into humour and into characters that they've built up over several years and really start to move away from some of the bigger sort of charity focuses and partnerships that they were highlighting in previous years as we were coming through the pandemic. So, Andrew, what do you make of this move away from brand purpose and the conversations that are happening in the marketing world around this?
I think given the early evidence we're seeing and the economic situation cannot be underestimated as a factor, but it feels very, very much like purpose has served its purpose, for the time being at least. When we look at cyclical sales periods and the way in which marketing and advertising is designed, you can go back and look at how things are sold when things are good and how things are sold when things are tough. Purpose leads very, very well if you can apply a certain amount of you can do this better or the guilt element. But that's very, very hard to do when people are struggling. I am fully aware that during tough times, the UK tends to give more rather than less, but at the same time, buying behaviours change, inflation is a huge factor, and driving a purpose-driven narrative has an element of guilt built into it. Whether it's meant to or not, you are either saying we are doing this way because it's better, or we're saying we are doing this way because it's the right thing to do. Or in the case of something like the John Lewis Christmas adverts over the last few years, especially the one during COVID, where you're saying, we know times are tough, we know everybody's going through a difficult situation, look at this thing you can support that does all of this wonderful good. But if you think about that advert, for example, you're not really, there's an element of guilt in that process as well, that ad is necessary in the first place. It makes you warm and cuddly, but it also says support this thing. Purpose marketing was designed by charities specifically originally and has now been transposed into business. And it's very difficult to apply that charity methodology in an environment where people are struggling, when actually what they want to do and be is buoyed by the situation, not to be made to feel worse about their situation.
And it might feel quite controversial for us as a communications agency that works with essentially purpose-driven brands, organisations, charities, to be saying that purpose is over as the headline message in your campaigns, but there is evidence to back this up. So System 1, who rank the effectiveness of ads and have software to do that and use a predictive indicator around the ads' level of brand building ability and success, have run this for several years on Christmas campaigns and have found that the purpose-driven ones just really don't perform as well as the ones that we've seen this year. So Sainsbury's World War I themed advert in 2014, Iceland's Greenpeace crossover, and John Lewis's partnership with Age UK for Man on the Moon scored 1 or 2 stars out of 5. And in comparatively, ads that are using humour and that are using some of the techniques that have kind of gone out of fashion in recent years as purpose has taken over, are actually scoring, 4s, 5s for effectiveness.
It's worth noting that humour ads last longer. They can be run for longer. They actually perform better. And actually, there's a recent research study, I think out of Penn State, but I'd have to check, that shows that The longer you run an ad for brand building, the more effective it becomes. Now, that's very hard to do with purpose messaging because the purpose becomes more important than the brand if you run those adverts long term. And when customer loyalty is shifting as effectively as it is right now, something I can't remember the exact figure, Sean, I'm sure you'll know, the number of people changing supermarkets has jumped massively. The number of people changing their buying habits has jumped massively. So building brand loyalty long term is incredibly important, and you're not doing that with purpose ads in the same way because those people are changing supermarkets based on cost, and they are changing their buying habits based on cost. And when you talk about hierarchy of needs, cost beats out purpose every time.
Yeah, so interestingly, there are numerous studies about humour and absurdity and things in advertising, but research suggests that around 80 to 90% of people find those adverts more memorable. And there was some research done by eye tracking company Lumen Research into ad recall, and they found that for print advertising, ad recall goes up from 25% if an ad is viewed for under 1 second to 45% for ads viewed between 1 and 2 seconds. Now, obviously, that's in print, but when we're talking about digital, we know that dwell time is really, really important for the algorithm. And we know that there was some recent research that up to 80% of videos and reels on Instagram and Facebook aren't hitting the level of dwell time that they need to hit for memorability and ad recall. So we're really seeing, as budgets are getting tighter and companies are having to be really careful about what assets they're creating and how much content they can put out there. And at the same time, engagement and reach and everything else organically is down on all of the platforms. We're really seeing advertising teams and marketing teams start to prioritize, how do we get our dwell time up? How do we get our engagement up organically so that our ad budget can go further and so that we are performing on these channels while times are tough? And humour really seems to be the way forward for that.
It repositions you as a counter narrative perspective to those purpose driven brands that are not performing, which will give a period of growth in itself, but combine that with the algorithms and everything else. And you do hit a point where you don't just need to look at it as ads. Yes, we're talking about it as ads, but actually applying it across your communications and trying to brighten and improve the feeling your customers get. Because that's what it really comes down to, and what we're really talking about, and what that data says to me is customers want to feel joy rather than requirement, I think would be the best word.
Coming back to your earlier point, Andrew, about consumers changing their shopping habits, it's 16% of ABC1 consumers that have changed their main supermarket specifically due to the rise of cost of living, and an additional 9% that have said that they've switched but didn't mention cost of living as the reason why, but is likely to be having an impact. And that's since the beginning of 2022. And obviously, supermarkets are kind of ingrained as our subconscious behavior. So for us to consciously go out and change that decision is a reflection on how many purchasing decisions are changing. And that's a really interesting demographic as well, because obviously ABC1s are your highest earners. So even your highest earners are shifting their behavior, shifting where they shop. And we know that for any brand talking about sustainability, you risk triggering that attitude behavior gap. Customers say that they want sustainability, that they want purpose, that they want these values, and that they say in surveys that they look for that when they shop, and even that they're willing to spend more money on it. But the buying data just doesn't back that up in the majority of cases. And we know from a behavioural science perspective that price and convenience are always going to win out instead of sustainability.
Purpose brands can't not talk about their purpose. They just need to deprioritize it in their messaging matrix comparative to normal, comparative to how they've been doing it previously for the circumstance. But in terms of talking about purpose, linking it back to that age and persona capacity around how are your purchasers behaving in regards to cost of living.
But one of the areas that brands, especially challenger brands in their first few years, seem to neglect in favor of purpose almost is actually digging down to just the fundamentals of who can afford your product. And really, the rise of purpose over the years has pushed brands to think more about who aligns with us on values. And if they align with us on values, they will buy us regardless of our price point. And obviously, what we're seeing during the cost of living crisis is that, yes, they may have aspirations to buy in line with their values, but they are going to prioritize price. So, doing that demographic work to really hone in on who has the disposable income to be able to afford you and having much tighter audience groups can be really, really beneficial.
If you can show that a specific age group behaves in a specific way, may have children, may not have children, etc., then you can work out their income, their disposable income, and how likely they are to be able to buy your product, which is always our starting point. And then from there, you can work out why they would need your product and then how to sell that product to them.
So, in terms of practically applying all of the things that we're talking about here, going forward into this year, it's really about being very specific about your audiences, honing in on who can afford your products, who can afford your services, and rather than blanket messaging them with your purpose, with your values, and hoping that that resonates, actually digging into their age group, what that means for them in terms of their cultural references, things from their childhood and growing up, and things that relate to them in terms of how they're getting through the cost of living, what economic factors are affecting them, and then using that to frame your purpose. So it's not necessarily completely moving away from talking about your sustainability or talking about your social value, but it's making it really relevant to them and to your product and the wider context of your business.
Purpose needs to be balanced with need. And to understand need and the needs of your customers, you have to understand your customers. I think you're absolutely right when you say purpose brands have, over the last few years, concentrated on saying, this is our purpose and you are our people. Come join us. And now that we're in a need-based economy where fundamentally, if you're going to be keeping your sales steady or growing them, you're going to have to concentrate on what people need rather than what they would like. And if we're in that situation, then we have to understand those needs and how those people think, feel, and behave, as well as still saying, you need this, but we also do good. It's reprioritization of the messaging hierarchy, not an abandonment of that purpose messaging.
I completely agree with you. And I think nowhere is this kind of more pertinent than actually the political landscape and the big shifts that we saw around the green agenda last year. And obviously, with an election on the horizon this year, what that means for climate campaigners and environmental campaigners, but also businesses in this space, because that is going to be in the headlines. It's going to be a prominent talking point, and it is going to have an influence, especially if your consumer group, if your audiences are consumer groups that are very politically engaged. It's going to have an influence on their relationship with your purpose and their relationship with your communications throughout the year as it becomes more prominent in the headlines. Obviously, last year saw rowing back on green promises and green pledges and almost an attack on the green agenda from all political sides, really, after the by-elections. And then we had COP, and we saw, obviously, the kind of very strong debate around the language on fossil fuels, but ultimately really positive steps in the right direction. We are most likely going to have an election this year. And for organisations that want to put climate, nature, sustainability, the environment on the agenda, they really need to be prioritising that planning now and starting to build that influence now. And even businesses that aren't kind of actively politically engaged need to start paying attention to that environment, because, as I said, it is going to have an impact on their consumers' mindsets. It's also going to bring events and elements like the cost of living to the forefront of consumers' minds, which is going to have an impact on their behaviour. So, Andrew, your team did some really, really interesting research last year on the green agenda and its role in this election and the impact that it's having on voter behaviour. Do you want to talk us through some of the kind of key headlines from that research and what we need to be aware of going into 2024?
I think I have to start with the obvious, which is if sustainability campaigners and environmental campaigners don't get serious, this is going to be a bad election for sustainability and environmental topics and issues. And when I say serious, what I mean is reasonable asks that are achievable and can be turned into policy and manifesto promises and can be implemented by the government properly, whichever government that may be next. The election is far, far tighter than it looks. Yes, right now, as of recording, the Labour Party is 18 points ahead in the polls. But our research shows, and we've seen similar research from other people, including UK Polling Report, that suggests that the Labour Party does not, even at 18 points ahead in the polls, have enough to win a clear majority. It may not win a clear majority. This election is going to be far, far tighter than people think. For the Labour Party to become the next majority government, it would need between 20 and 24 points in the polls. It's currently got about 18. So it's tighter than it looks, which means every vote counts. And more constituencies will be in play in this election than we have seen for decades, probably since 1997. So what does that mean? It means that jobs, cost of living, and quality of life, as well as the NHS, and I'd include that in quality of life, are going to be forefront. That cost of living element and the behavioural pattern that voters go through of prioritising what they need now to be more comfortable and be able to survive, that Maslow's hierarchy kicks in and voters prioritise their immediate needs. As a result, the environmental and sustainability agenda could very easily drop off. And we can see that from the polling. I mean, cost of living polls at about 50 to 60% in terms of number of voters picking it as one of their top three priorities, whereas the environment polls at 23 to 27% with ABC ones and 19% with C2Ds. In other words, the upper middle classes are more supportive than the traditionally working classes or traditionally poorer parts of that scale. What I would say there is that unless we change the way we talk and start prioritising, again, needs of the average voter and specifically the constituencies where pressure can be applied, we stand a very big chance that it will get knocked off the agenda.
One of the things that really shone out from our policy team's research for me was that the attitude behaviour gap, which we often talk about and consider in terms of sustainable consumption, is very, very much applicable, if not stronger, when it comes to voting. And again, in polls and in questionnaires and surveys, people say that they want to prioritise climate, that they want the government to be taking climate and nature action. But actually, when it comes down to their voting priorities and what is kind of front of mind for them on election day when they're going to the ballot, that totally changes. So it's really framing the narrative. And I think the key thing for me and the big kind of light bulb moment that actually became kind of fundamental to one of the campaigns we ran last year was the idea that the next government is going to be the last government with any power to change anything before 2030. Now, we know that that's a really crucial deadline in terms of climate and nature and the crises that we're in. And when you start to see it like that, you realise just how important not just this election is, but actually building the influence now to have a relationship with whatever the next government is going to look like, and to have those causes on the agenda. And really, in other sectors like homelessness and mental health, that change and that big shift and that big impact has only really happened when that sector has come together and when everybody has started talking the same language and saying the same message. And one of the things that we're seeing within the sustainability kind of echo chamber is, quite frankly, infighting and mixed messages, mixed priorities, and no kind of clear narrative around the solutions. And the research, as you said, is really showing that we need to frame that in terms of quality of life, cost of living, and those things that are the voters' priorities, so that the voters are prioritising climate outcomes and that they are putting pressure on their local candidates, and we are starting to build that momentum. Now, if we're not able to get that cut through, even within the sector itself, and if we are too hung up on talking about climate for climate's sake or nature for nature's sake and not getting out of our own way and shifting that narrative, yes, we want to talk about climate and sustainability because that's what we're passionate about, but actually that sustainable change might have big impacts on cost savings or might have big benefits to health. And actually, if we can reframe the message like that and we can get it out there, we can make it a real front of mind priority to voters and therefore politicians, and we can keep building that influence.
As I said earlier at the start of this section, the sector needs to get serious. And I don't mean that in the sense of treating the issue with more seriousness, because we all know what's going to happen if we don't fix this stuff. But the sector needs to get serious about how it communicates to your average voter if it wants to get its issues on the political agenda in what will be the last election before 2030.
And that feels like a really good time to mention that we do have another Lunch and Learn coming up on the 20th of February, all about how to prepare your 2024 election campaign. So do make sure you're following our LinkedIn page to be notified when we go live with that one.
Well, that brings us on to the final major trend for 2024, and that's regulation. We have seen significant changes from many of the regulators, including the CMA, the Competitions and Markets Authority, the ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority, which isn't just advertising, it's also anything you publish publicly as a business, and also the FCA in terms of regulating ESG and communications around environmental financing. Now, a lot of those things changed towards the end of 2023, but that trend is likely to continue. And I haven't even mentioned the Green Claims Code, ESG reporting, the changes there. The breadth of changes within the UK alone is significant, and businesses are going to be looking at how they make those changes without green hushing, and how, if they sell across Europe as well, they apply the European regulation. Sian, what's your initial take on what's happened, and where do you think it's going?
These regulations are coming thick and fast, and the regulators are taking action. So at the end of last year, we were seeing adverts get banned nearly every single day across different sectors for a variety of kind of elements of getting the Green Claims Code wrong. And obviously this is now coming into finance as well. We've also got reporting standards. So this is the section of the Lunch and Learn where we get very acronym heavy, but there is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive coming in as well. And there's talk of mandatory scope 3 reporting and things like that. So really for organisations, sustainability teams, being on top of the changing regulatory environment is going to be key this year because it is changing so quickly. And really for that to happen and to not fall into the trap of having a siloed approach, it's about creating a culture of compliance in your organisation. Our team attended a session with the Advertising Standards Agency, who have been driving a lot of this, but obviously now it's the financial regulators as well. But towards the end of 2023, and they are starting to use AI. So they are scanning so many adverts every single day using AI now. But they were very, very clear that they don't want companies to green hush. They don't want companies not to talk about this stuff. They just want to move away from very broad brush claims like eco-friendly and sustainable. And obviously the EU are a bit ahead of us on that, and they are looking to ban words like that, whereas our regulator is saying if you're going to use them, they're very broad, so you need to have very, very specific evidence and a lot of evidence to support that claim. It has to be proportional within your business. So it's getting to the point where actually it's very hard to give general advice on compliance because the guidance is becoming so specific. And that's where we want it to get to. The more specific it gets, the easier it is to comply and the easier it is to spot what's greenwashing and what's not. But really, for organizations, this can't just come down to your sustainability lead anymore. It does affect any communications that you're putting out there, from your adverts, obviously being the kind of front of mind one, but to your impact reporting and your sustainability reports. If you're publishing those as a public document, they need to be compliant as well. So any communications that you're putting out there, which means that your communications team, your marketing team really need to be up to speed. But ultimately, the kind of key thing across all of this is having the data and having the evidence, and that comes from every single department. So whatever size your organization, whatever sector you're in, it's really about building that culture of compliance, building that confidence across your team, and ensuring that you are staying up to speed with the regulations, you are taking efforts to be compliant, and you are splitting that workload across the organization so that nothing is getting missed.
I really like the way the UK regulators deal with implementing a framework for how we talk, much more than in comparison to, say, the EU regulator, which tends towards banning things. UK regulators tend to say you can say what you want, you can do what you want, as long as you can prove it and as long as it's legal. And that is, for me, a better way of doing it. It means words like sustainable and sustainability can still be used, but that the body of evidence for a broad claim like this is a sustainable product is now set so high.
So in terms of implementation and taking this forward into 2024, it is really about staying up to speed with the changing regulatory landscape, and making sure that you are compliant. And I think where we've seen a lot of sustainability focused organisations kind of get stuck with this is that they have the evidentiary basis, they have the claims, but they're not necessarily presenting them in the right way. So it's definitely not assuming that you are compliant because you are, as sustainable as you can be, or you are making positive impact, and it is going in and checking those claims and really setting up systems and processes within your organization to create that culture of compliance. The earlier that you do that, the easier you're going to find it as the regulations get tighter and as these reporting directives start to filter down and apply to your business size. You won't be surprised to know that we also have a lunch and learn to help with that. So on the 1st of February, we will be doing a session on impact reporting, aligning yourself in a compliant way with the regulations, and actually turning your impact report and that process into an income driving activity for your organization so that you can prioritize getting that impact report done, communicating that with your customers, but really navigating all the things that we've talked about today. So if this session has resonated and you are an organization that does have to produce an impact report or chooses to, then do come along to that session as well.
And that brings us to the end of our Sustainability Trends Lunch and Learn. Don't forget to download the accompanying PDF report via our website. But in the meantime, it's goodbye from both of us.